Hi everyone, I'm Adán Martín, and today I want to present you a new tutorial, in this case about Forest Pack. Forest Pack is a plugin, which we can find for 3 studios from the IDO software company, which allows us to distribute and add randomness very easily and very quickly. And we can build, for example, an image like this in a matter of minutes. Initially, I had proposed the tutorial to create precisely this image that we have here, which is an image in which we have a few trees, some bushes, and then a very simple lawn. But as I started at UR, I've realized that there may be people who don't have the basic understanding of how Forest Pack works. So I'm going to divide this tutorial into 2 parts. First, we are going to see the basics of Forest Pack, which is Forest Pack, how its different menus work for those people who do not have experience with this plugin, and then in a second part, we will see how, in a practical way, to do this image and perhaps some other practical exercise. So if you already know how Forest Pack works, you are already familiar with the tabs and with the working methodology with the plugin. I recommend that you skip this tutorial to the introductory one that is intended for those who do not know how to use the plugin, and wait on to part 2 where we'll see how to create this image right, and some other practical images using Forest Pack. Let's get started, and as always, I hope it's very interesting. To begin to familiarize ourselves with pack flowers, what we are going to do is that we are going to start with a very simple scene, and with some objects where we will be able to recognize very easily what the program does, and then we will see how to create grass or how to create a forest, for example. The first thing I need is inside the IDO software tab, Forest Pro, and click on our surface. It could also be a spray later. We will see how that type of distribution would work. And then automatically, Forest Pack creates for us a series of billboards distributed on our surface. Here, right away, you have a ton of menus and a ton of options that can be a bit intimidating at first. But we are going to do as we always do, the same as when we saw, for example, UFX. What we are going to do is focus one by one on each of the categories, looking at the most fundamental options. I am not going to cover parameter by parameter everything that the software does, because the tutorial would take too long. But most of these values are very intuitive and very easy to use, and just by reading the little description of the parameter, we can get an idea of what each of them does. Before starting to work with Forest, a personal recommendation that I make is that you change the name of forest, for example, to something that allows you to recognize it. Because when you want a very complex scene, you can end up with many forests. See, Ford is in the same scene, and selecting them can be a problem. So, one thing you can do is give it a name so that it is easy to identify them within our selector by name. And another thing you can do is give it a selection group. For example, here we can put Forest Base, so that every time I need to select my base, I simply have to select my selection group. This, I tell you, it is a personal recommendation. Let's start with the most basic, geometry. In this tab, what we control is the geometry that is going to be distributed on our surface. By default, I tell you, the bill steels come, which in the past were widely used, and with this we could simulate a forest from afar with trees, with alpha, and it turned out quite well. But the machines have already evolved a lot, and we can now use custom objects, which can be a tree, they can be Fesped swords, and so on. So, we're going to use our teapot here. So that we can visualize it well while we work with the different parameters, I am going to access the display options, and I am going to activate Mesh. Then we will see in depth how this tab works. We can make a series of basic adjustments to our geometry. For example, we can scale this geometry, we can reposition it in Z, and we can also set a separate collision radius for each of the elements. We can also add more than one element, look, and they can have different categories. This other element is going to be our cube. And do you see that we can establish, for example, an individual scale for the cube and for the type, or we can modify the global scale of the 2 elements at the same time. Basically, this is what we do within this Gig tab. Secondly, one of the options of the following most important tabs that we have, since it is the distribution one, I am going to try to place them in order. In the distribution tab, we control how this geometry is going to be distributed on this surface. The first parameter through which we can establish how forest will behave is through an image, and by default you have a few created. Let's see what happens if we select full, for example. Full would be the equivalent of a completely white image. And so you see, what we get is a distribution. Let's go back to full, a distribution perfectly equidistant between each of the elements that forest is distributing. Or you can use a distribution map that has holes in it. For example, the zones on this distribution map make a lot of parts of this surface that don't have objects. With this option, what you control is, so to speak, the scale of this image. As you go setting smaller and smaller values, what you do is that for you to understand it visually, it is as if you were increasing the tiling of this image. So obviously, since the objects are placed closer and closer, and if you decrease the tiling, because you have the objects more and more separated. If you do not like any of these options that the software brings by default, which are maps created by them, what you can do is use a custom map. For example, we are going to use a check here so that you can see it very easily. So the white areas of our check would have a 100% distribution, and the black areas would have no distribution at all, and we can still control the scale you're using this map here. So, we see that we can do really complex things because we are using a check, but we could use a noise, we could use a map that we paint ourselves. There are many possibilities. For now, we're going to use one of the default maps that the plugin brings. Another interesting option that we have within this tab before seeing all these, here are the collisions. Note that what is happening here can happen to us on many occasions, and that is that there are objects on top of each other. That can sometimes be interesting when we are, for example, creating pet fees especially, but other times it can be a problem. When we activate the collision system, what we do is that we tell the plugin to calculate a radius where there cannot be more than one object. By default, when you activate them, they are only activated in the being, and to be able to visualize them in the viewport, you have to also activate this other tab here. So you see that even if I lower this value a lot, there can no longer be two objects, one on top of the other. It happens that on many occasions, as this radius is calculated automatically, we may want this radius to be smaller. For example, here is a small graph, a small drawing that illustrates very well what this parameter does. So we can reduce the radius, for example, to prevent some objects from being on top of others, but which are slightly overlapping in some areas. This will allow us to have an extra degree of control. We will be able to determine very well how we want our objects to behave. I often use the collision option as insurance, so to speak, because if you turn it off, it could be the case that, well, you have a geometry that is too dense. So one thing you can do to avoid that is, well, activate even with a very low radius. And that guarantees that even if you go too far in this number and even if you get to set it very low, you will never have a lot of elements. And other times I also use it simply so that there is not one tree on top of another. All of these options that you have here allow you to control the map that we were talking about earlier. We can move, that is, move our map within the XY coordinates. We are going to put a slightly larger value here so that the samples don't take so long. So we can pan that map, as you see, on the X-axis, on the Y-axis, and we can also rotate it with this option here. We can set a tolerance value. What this value allows us to control is from what value of gray in our map. In grayscale, the plugin will consider that an object can appear. The lower this value is, the more chances there are for an object to appear on the gray maps. The higher it is, the more contrasted the map is. Imagine that this is as if we applied it to our distribution map, which, in this case, is one generated by the software, but it could be one set by us, as if we applied a level adjustment. For example, another of the interesting options that we have within the Distribution tab are these three distribution modes. What random does is that it randomly distributes the objects that we have. Now we have 2, but it could be 10, 20, or 100 in our distribution map, or we can tell you that distributes them, for example, in clusters, which is a very interesting way of distribution. What does this do? Well, we are going to configure a smaller value with clusters. What we want are, well, small groups, so that a single object is distributed in each of these groups. To see it a little more extensively, let's also create a weight, for example. And to our forest, we are going to add a new element in the Geometry tab that will be our weight. So, as you can see, what clusters do is create small areas where only one of the models we are using can exist. They are very useful to generate plants. For example, plants are often distributed in this way, that is, they are in small islands in our lawn. They can be used for a lot of things, and within the clusters we can configure the size is something similar to what we had above in the distribution, which allows us to control the size of our clusters. We can also control, for example, the border, that is, the higher this value is, the more some clusters mix with each other. And we can also configure the noise, which what it does is that in our clusters, if we put a value of noise, for example, 50% so much, well, in a cluster that only has spheres, suddenly, well, there is one of the other elements. And if we reach 100%, well, in the end, we have practically the same thing as if we were using random. And another distribution option that we have is this one here, where we are going to use a map. For example, we are going to create a map here with two very defined colors, a red color, for example, and a green color. And we are going to apply it here as a distribution map. And so now, what we are going to do is that we are going to tell it that, for example, these two elements are going to they are going to be red, and this one here is going to be green. So, using the color that we put our objects here, he's going to distribute them using this distribution map is another way to control where our objects are going to be distributed. For now, we are going to leave it random, and we are going to put a color here that is not so flashy. We have already seen more or less how the Metrics tab and the Distribution tab work. Now we are going to see a new tab, which is the Areas tab. In this tab, we can control everything related to the surfaces or the areas where our trees or our objects are going to be distributed, where they are not going to be distributed. We can control our forest using several methods. For example, we can control them using a spline that we can now here, for example, create unemployment. Let's create it here. Let's select our forest. We are going to add a new surface, in this case, type spline. By default, the new surface is created in include mode, but I can create it in exclude mode, so that everything contained within that new surface or that new area is excluded. Notice that, for example, I can activate and deactivate the different surfaces, this one that is created by default when our forest is created, and now I can deactivate it. And since I have this other one from Sprint, where we have set a value to include, well, now I can control in which parts my forest is created using a spline, for example. So we can have much more control over our forest. Notice that we can also transform this into an editable spline and modify it in real time. Okay? It is a very useful tool. Let's see what else we can do with areas, for example. We are going to eliminate our circle for the moment, and we are going to create an object. For example, imagine that what we want, we have a house, or we have a very big tree, or a path, whatever. Well, we have a geometry. And in this case, what we are going to tell Forest is that we are going to create a new area, in this case, an object. And what happens is that Forest doesn't apply where this object is. This can be interesting for us, for example, well, not to put trees on top of a house. Notice that here we have a series of options that are very interesting, that what they are going to allow us to control is how forest is going to behave. At the edges, for example, of this object. And those options are these here. We can control, for example, the density, and we can tell it then that we are going to raise this value. We are going to tell you that around this object, of all the objects that are excluding forest, which in this case is only our box, but could be, for example, also extra spline, we are going to make it smaller so that you can see how this works. We are going to create a spline, and we are going to configure this spline as exclude. So now, in all the zones where I am excluding elements either with a box or with a spline, this effect is going to be applied to me here. And we control this effect with this curve. So now, for example, what we are controlling. What is it? The density. And we are controlling that density with a curve that goes from 100 to 0. So what we're doing is we're removing some of the elements on the edges of this object using this curve. We could also, instead of controlling the density, for example, control the scale. And look, we're going to increase this value so you can see. We are going to put a very large value. So go, and as we increase this value, well, 500 centimeters from this object towards the outside, we produce a change of scale. And with this curve, we can control how that change of scale occurs. Imagine, for example, that what we want is that, well, the change of scales is more abrupt, and suddenly, well, we have, for example, 1, we are going to make a more strange curve. Good? So we can very well control how scale changes occur in our forest using certain surfaces. We could do the same with the include mode. If we had some elements here that are included, we could control their behavior with this other value here. It is very simple and very powerful to create all kinds of, well, variations in our forest. As you can see, we can also use another forest. Imagine that we have trees. Then we will see this when we do the practical example. We can use another forest so that this forest is not applied where the elements of that other forest are. It is very powerful, since I tell you. And we can also, for example, paint an area. We're going to exclude an area, and we're going to paint that area. We're going to define some larger brush values because now they're a little small. Let's put here, what do I know, 500? Yes, such a thing. So we can now paint an area, see? And define zones in which we do not want forest, for example, or we could do, on the contrary, we could, for example, deactivate our surface. We are going to delete our cube. We are going to delete everything. And we are going to create a new zone painting, and it is going to be an area where we are going to include forest, and we are going to paint where we want our trees. The next important tab we have to look at is the Surface tab. As you can see, I am not going in the original order in which these tabs are configured, because I am going to try to focus on the most basic ones, the ones that will be enough for you to create your first forest. So in the Surface tab, what we go to is precisely that, our surfaces. Now here we have a surface that was created by default when we created our forest by clicking on this plane. It has automatically created a surface for us. We have 2 modes of distribution on this surface that we will see with a practical example. We will use V, for example, when we want to distribute objects not so much to make terrains, or not so much to simulate natural, but, for example, to do other types of things. If we want to distribute a forklift, for example, on a sphere or on something that has faces facing down or facing in all directions, this will be more interesting for us. But when we want to simulate, well, a typical forest or nature on a terrain, I recommend that you use this option. One very important thing that you have to keep in mind is that if you don't activate this tab, any modification you make to the surface will not automatically affect the forest. Let's see an example, for example. Before you leave me, we're going to set the forest to pretty much the default, and we're going to turn this back on, and we're going to remove our elements from here so it's all easier to see. So now, if we make any changes to this surface, for example, we are going to apply a smooth turn to it. We are going to apply a displacement map to it. And to this displacement map, we are going to apply, for example, plus a Mercon noise. We're going to introduce it here. Well, we're going to make it a little bigger, Voronoi, and we're going to put a little turbulence on it. Well, let's see. We are going to create a kind of terrain, okay? Now we're going to adjust the scale here, which is still very small. We are simply going to generate a randomness. You could have done it with a noise, well, what you used to do to generate this type of surface. So here we have our surface, which now has, well, a little bit of elevation. And this will allow us to understand a little what I wanted to tell you about. If you look closely right now, these elevations that we are introducing are not affecting our forest. If we want our forays to automatically adapt to changes in our surface, we have to check this tab. And so now when we make any changes, our displacement will see how the forklift will be affected. When we have surfaces that are no longer flat, such as this one you have here, one of the options that forest has can interest us a lot. Not to simulate trees, but maybe to simulate grass, for example. And it is this first option that we have within the Surface tab. By default, all elements are always pointing upwards. But if we set 0 here, the elements will point in the direction of our surface normals. So that you can better see it, instead of using these items, we're going to use a little different items. We are going to modify this element a bit, and it will be much easier to understand. And we are going to eliminate in our forest all the geometry that we are not using. So, you see, when we use that distribution mode on our surface, what we do is that our objects are oriented in the direction of our surface normals. Normally, when we go to simulate a forest, well, the trees behave more like this. Okay, he is always looking up. But there will be occasions where, when we want to simulate grass, for example, we may be more interested in this other option, and we can also change the normals of our surface. Another interesting option that we have here is we can set limits on the distribution of our Ford. We can tell you, for example, that there is no distribution in our Ford from, for example, 100 centimeters. So, forest is only going to be distributed after 100 centimeters, and I can change this top margin. Or I can have forest only apply, for example, from 200 inches or 300 centimeters and up. So, I'm only going to be placed at the tips of this surface. Another type of limitation that we can establish is a limitation by angle. For example, we are going to lower the angle so that our trees, well, they are not going to be able to be distributed over, well, the cliffs, for example. And in this way, we are going to distribute our trees only on those faces that form. In this case, for example, angles less than 45 degrees. So as you can see, we have a lot of control over our forest in this tab. Another very important tab is the Transform tab, where we will be able to add randomness in some of the most common transformations, such as translation, rotation, and scale. For example, if we activate the random translation, what we are doing is telling Forest to apply a variation in the x-axis and in the y-axis that goes between -50 and 50. Let's turn them off. For example, we can now at least apply -50 and at most 50, and in between, he is going to use random values. We could also do the same for in the z-axis. If we wanted to, well, I don't know, imagine a volume of rocks, or when we want to simulate volumes, we can benefit from using this type of random transformation. Normally, unless our distribution is too homogeneous, it is not usually useful to accept the translation. However, for example, it is very common to use to generate mainly forests and similar things, a variation in rotation. Notice that all our geometry automatically acquires a random position. Look, Before having all our teapots, for example, pointing in the same direction, and now, as we have told you, that it has a rotation that goes between 0 and 359 on the axis, since our spheres are rotated in all directions. This will allow us, for example, when we simulate a forest, that using few trees, it seems that we have many more. And we can also activate a variation in the scale, which will also allow us, well, to make it appear that we have more objects. Or add some randomness to our distribution pattern. We can control all these options with a map. For example, we are going to do it with the scale map because it is perhaps where it is best seen. We are going to control the scale of our forest using a check, which is a map where everything will be seen very well. So, when we place a map here, by default, nothing happens. For this map to affect, in this case, for example, the scale, we have to activate this tab here. And now, by default, if the probability mob tab is not activated, what this map does is that the black parts of the map tell it the value that these areas must have. That is, the minimum would be the black parts, and the white parts of that map is the maximum that we put here. However, if we activate this other option, what the plugin is doing is, in the white parts, there is 100% probability that a random variation between these values will occur. However, in the parts black, no randomness occurs. There are two ways that we can control the scale. And we could also use a map in RGB, where each of the channels would allow us to individually control the scale in X, Y, Y, Z, and also in all these parameters we can do the same. So, you'll see when we see the practical examples, how we can use these accounts to make our FESPED or to make our forests more interesting. These tabs that we have seen are the most basic and the most important in forest, those of geometry, distribution, area, surface, and transformation. But let's also go over the others a bit, just in case you need them in any situation. For example, the tree editor allows us to manually edit our forest. We can, for example, select an individual element and move or delete it. For example, we can add specific new elements. For example, we can say, I want to add a weight, and I want to add it here. Either I want to add a box, and I want to add it here, or I want to randomly add any of the items in the list. And we could also, for example, let's see, select all the types of my forest. I could delete them. I can apply a randomize that will distribute to the elements, change the size and everything. Here we can do a series of operations, destined to manually solar our forest. For example, you have distributed the forest, but there is a tree that you don't like exactly where it is. It doesn't help the composition of your image, and you want to move it to the right or to the left, or you want to change it to another tree, etc. So, this tab is going to serve us mainly for that. Let's put it back to default. In the camera tab, what we can do is use a camera to define where the elements are going to be shown and where they are not going to be shown. For example, imagine that we have this camera placed here. And so, we're only seeing these elements in our scene, but we don't want to see all these elements that aren't going to be seen in the scene, because that's going to cause us to have to calculate a lot of geometry that isn't going to be seen. Contribute to our image. So in Forest, we can select our forest. And in the Camera tab, select our camera. So automatically, we are going to exaggerate it so that you can see the effect. Well, we are going to put the camera much further forward. You see, Forest automatically eliminates all the metrics that the camera is not seeing that can help us save a lot of calculations. Think, for example, that if you are simulating a forest, or if you are using Forest to generate buildings or to generate very tall objects that cast very important shadows in our scene. If, for example, you activate this option, the trees behind the camera will no longer contribute to reflections, shadows, etc. So we can use this, for example, on the grass or when we are simulating some stones or things like that, but many times not. Here you activate this option so that trees that are important in the scene. Okay? The remaining tabs are not less important, but perhaps they have less common uses. For example, the Shadow tab will be useful when we use the template geometry type, and in this tutorial we are not going to see it. If in the future we do a tutorial, and we see how we can simulate a forest far away using this technique, well, maybe we will see it on that occasion. The Materials tab allows us to add a certain degree of color theory, for example, but I usually prefer to do it from the material with a texture that forest has to do the same, and a little more complete. We have the Materials tab Animation, where we can control various aspects related to animation in forest, and perhaps one of the most interesting things is that we can control, for example, the frame in which our animation begins, because if we load a proxy, for example, using a map, simulating large areas of animated vegetation, if the animation of the trees is very strong, that is, if it is not something very smooth, it can become quite a challenge, and it is difficult to make animated vegetation that is realistic. I would like to do a tutorial on how to animate vegetation, because in Grove FX it is very simple, and as you know, I love that plug and I use it very regularly, and I would like us to see how using Forest and Grow FX we can simulate, well, surfaces of animated vegetation, but for now we are not going to cover it in this tutorial. Finally, we have the Display tab where we can control how our forest is going to be shown in the viewport. Basically, we have several different preview modes. By default, I think it is marked Adaptive, I'm not sure, and we can put Mesh, we can put Proxy, we can put, for example, that they are boxes, we can put that they are pre-established models, arrows. This is all related to how we want our forest to look in the viewport. Perhaps the most common when you start working with very complex flowers is Point Cloud. In Point Cloud, you can configure a global resolution of the cloud of points that affects all the forests in the scene, or you can configure a local solution of this forest. You can also tell it to show you the color IDs of the objects you are using, that it be more or less shaded in the cloud of points or opacity, and it is important that you take into account that, for example, in the render part we have configured a maximum number of objects. Sometimes we have to increase this value if for whatever reason, because we have a super large area and we want to distribute millions and millions of objects. Obviously, you have to be careful with that, because if you put very large numbers here, if you start distributing millions and millions of objects, your scene can become completely crazy. But it is important that you know that since these two numbers are different, there are times when what we are seeing in the viewport is not what we are going to see in the render. If we want to see exactly the same thing in the render as in the viewport, you have to put the same values here. Okay? And when you start here within the distribution map to reduce the amount, well, if you reach that maximum, you will also be seeing it in the viewport. You have to be careful with that. And in this Display tab, well, it is practically the only thing that interests us. How to control what we are missing to display on the screen. So let's do a little recap on what we've seen now before moving on to the hands-on part of Forest. We have seen how from geometry we could control the objects that we were going to distribute, select them, use, for example, custom objects and change some of their basic properties, such as scale, a small offset, the collision radius, etc. Then we had seen how we could, through the Distribution Map tab, configure how these objects are going to be distributed on our surface. We had seen that we had the ability to use a preset map or use a custom map, and we could set the scale of that map using this value. We also had the possibility to configure some parameters, such as the 3-hold, for example, to rotate or move that map. And we have also seen 3 different distribution modes. Random, which is simply a random distribution of the objects. Clusters, it allows us to control small groups of objects. And we have also seen Match Color ID that allowed us to define the objects using a map with colors. The collision system that allows us then to ensure that there are not 2 objects, one on top of the other, which is sometimes going to interest us. Other times I already tell you that we are going to see now when we begin to see the practical cases. We have also seen the Area tab, where we controlled everything related to the surfaces, the areas where we could add or remove parts of the forest, using, for example, another forest, using an object, using a paint. We have also seen how we could, for example, add some controls on the surface to limit where our forest appears. We could control, for example, the maximum height and the minimum height to distribute our forest, or we could also configure the angle of the faces where our forest is going to be applied, so that forest is not applied, for example, on a wall, vertical. We have also seen in the Transformation tab how we can add randomness to our forest and therefore to make it more interesting, well in the translation, the rotation, and the scale, and we have seen how we could control each of the parameters of these transformations, also using a map. We also saw how within 3 Editor we could individually modify some of the elements of our forest or add new elements individually. And we also saw, for example, with the camera option, we could delete forest in those parts that the camera is not seeing. And finally, we have seen the display option, where we can configure how we are doing. To display forest in our viewport, there were other options that I have said at the moment we are not going to see them in detail. In the next part of the tutorial, what we are going to see is how to apply these basic concepts to practical examples. We are going to, for example, a surface with grass, and then we will create the image that we saw at the beginning, where we have grass, where we have trees, and we will see how we can manage these types of scenes. I hope that this first part of the Forest Pack tutorial has helped those people who still did not know how this blowing works. In the second part of the tutorial, we will see the practical examples, where first, we will create grass, which is a good example, to familiarize ourselves with how forest works. And then, we will create a scene like this one that we have here, which is a super simple scene where we only have 3 forests. One for the trees, one for the bushes, and one for our lawn. But it's a good example of how we can create an interesting scene with Forest Pack in 4 or 5 clicks. If you liked the content of this tutorial, I would like you to subscribe to the channel to be aware of news. And now I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter page available, where you can follow the evolution of the new tutorials, and you can ask questions or suggest topics for new tutorials. As always, I hope you found it interesting and see you in the next one.